Good afternoon to this second activity for the participative meetings 2021. Today we are delighted to have Professor Hélène Landemore from the Yale University, and I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, but before that I would like to say some words about this participative meetings in 2021 towards a new constitution, and this has been organized by the committee of the when we got the different sectors, students and members of the academia in a quite active manner by means of two working groups, one that has to do with the methodology of the participation and the other part has to do with the communication. We have had an intense week of discussions, very interesting, with an active participation of the different groups. And among the activities that we decided to do is this couple of seminars. This is the second one. And after that, we will propose to have a consultation, a dialogue, deliberations, and also a series of analysis which are very interesting. And we hope to have the participation of the whole community. This process is very interesting inside the university and also to other areas. And there is a series of actions that are also coordinated with the constitutional group within the university. And also we've got a direct line at the level of the Senate and Congress. And also we are coordinating our connection with the constituent themselves. We have had some conversations with them, and this is a process of getting together and to set a dialogue of cooperation and to be part of the process that they are carrying out. So within this context of these participative meetings 2021, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Hélène Landemore. She is currently the professor of political sciences at Yale University. She was born in France and she studies in École Normale Supérieure in Paris. And she also studies in Sciences Po, also in Paris, and a few other French universities. Paris one, where another one. In 2001, after visiting a scholar at the Harvard, she was a visiting scholar at the Harvard University to do researches in the philosophy of economics and ended up enrolling in the PhD program in the political science department and completed her degree with a dissertation in the year 2008 on collective intelligence as an argument for democracy. After that, after going to Harvard, was doing a pre and postdoctoral studies in the College of France in Paris. And on the other side, she was in a project in a political theory project in the Brown University and also in MIT. After that, in both institutions in Brown and MIT, she had an assistant professor at Yale University, where she is now. And we've got this honor and the privilege of having Hélène in the second seminar. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Hélène and her presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Hélène, go ahead with your talk.
Thank you, Alejandro. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk and share my thoughts on how you can perhaps organize public participation in your current constitutional process. It's a really important time in Chilean history, and so whatever I can do to help is, of course, a great delight. So let me share my screen with you. I have a little bit of a PowerPoint to help guide my comments. So the idea is that I'm going to share what I think I've learned from observing different types of democratic experiments, democratic innovations that aimed to augment existing representative democracies with the wisdom of the people and the input and ideas of the larger public. So, but before I do that, before I go into the more empirical aspects of my presentation, I wanted to offer a brief reminder of what I see as the main issue with the systems we have inherited from the 18th century, representative governments. I think the problem with with representative democracy more broadly, is the oligarchic distribution of power that results from the use of elections as a selection mechanism for the rulers, basically. It's a lesson that the Greeks were well aware of, that Rousseau, Montesquieu, and more recent contemporary theorists, like, for example, Bernard Manin, have repeated at nauseam, and somehow I think we have yet to fully internalize the lesson from those authors, which is that when you select rulers via elections, even periodic elections, you end up empowering a very narrow slice of the population. It's the Platonic myth to this day that we should be ruled by the best and the brightest, by the confidence men, by the people who stand out socially in the eyes of most. And when we use elections, that's what we do. We empower a small group of people that then tend to stay in power and reproduce themselves as a group. And it's not necessarily that they are corrupt or ill-intentioned. In fact, that's never been one of the arguments I've used to criticize electoral democracy, if you will. The problem is more, or is also, one of cognitive bias. When you empower sort of a non-representative sample of the population, you end up with people who don't fully map out the problems of a given country, don't fully mobilize the larger wisdom of the country, and don't fully anticipate the consequences of the decisions they make, etc., etc. So it's no surprise then that at a time like ours, we are facing massive social protests in all kinds of countries, from my home country of France, where we've had the Yellow Vest movements, to the Brexit votes in the UK, to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, to, of course, the Chilean protests that led to this constitutional process that you've now entered for the past few months. So my proposal is summarized in a book that I recently published called Open Democracy, where I propose an alternative model of popular rule, which I call open democracy. And it's meant to be a form of regime where power is accessible to all on equal grounds. Which is not to say that it's a direct form of democracy, because I don't think that direct democracy is either feasible or desirable, but it's a version of what the Greeks had in mind when they talked about ruling and being ruled in turn. In my language, it's about representing and being represented in turn, including via the use of randomly selected bodies that distribute power more equally than elections can, on the basis of one person, one lottery ticket. So the core principles of this new model of open democracy that I'm not going to go into today, but that I just thought I would remind you of to sort of give a frame to these coming remarks. There are 5 of them, 5 institutional principles that should guide institutional reform if we are to democratize our existing systems. One is participation rights, the idea that beyond the right to vote for representatives, we should have the right to vote on outcomes directly, among other things, and initiate recalls, citizens' initiatives, things like that. Deliberation is another core principle. It requires that all the laws and policies that come out of our governments should pass through the filter of deliberation, an exchange of arguments and reason and information among democratic representatives and the larger public, to the extent that that's feasible. The third principle is the Majoritarian Principle, which requires that when there's a disagreement and we can't reach a consensus, then we go with the preferences and judgment of the larger number. The fourth principle is that when there is a need for delegation of the decision or delegation of the deliberation to a subgroup for lack of time or lack of feasibility, we need to have that work done by authentically democratic representatives. And that's, in a way, the more subtle and radical departure from representative government, because what I mean by democratic representation need not be synonymous with electoral representation. And in fact, in most cases, what I mean by that is actually what I call lotocratic representation, which is a representation performed by people who are selected by lot, so at random. Finally, the fifth principle is transparency, the idea that the system in which we live and the political structures and officials and people that govern us should be visible. We should be able to watch over them to a large extent. And whenever that's not possible, at least there should be transparency about the process, about the choices made, and in a way that creates accountability for the people. Let me also remind you of another principle, in my larger theory, which is the rationale for participation. Why do we want more popular public participation, including in a constitutional process? Because ultimately, you cannot have rule for the people, good governance, if you will, and therefore a good constitution at the end of the constitutional process, if the rule is not by the people, and in particular, in the case of the writing of a constitution, if the constitutional process is not by the people itself, meaning involves the people and let the decisions about the nature and the content of the social contract in their hands. And why is that? It's for a reason that I tend to call epistemic, meaning knowledge related, but that we can simply summarize with the beautiful formula of W.E.B. Du Bois, the American political philosopher and sociologist and historian and rights activist, who wrote beautifully in Dark Water that the main and the only and the real argument for democracy really is about the kind of wisdom that the rulers of men must have. So he writes, in the people, we have the source of that endless life and unbounded wisdom which the rulers of men must have. So the only way to get to that wisdom is by going to the source directly, the people, and therefore that's why you need participation. So in my model, the central institution of an open democracy is what I call the open mini-public. It's where I find it's easier to instantiate this idea of representing and being represented in turn. And that body, in my mind, should be relatively large, between 150 and 1,000 people. So there's a margin for choice. It should be randomly selected with stratified random sampling as needed to get the categories that matter for the given purpose. It should reach its decisions and proposals via deliberative methods. It should also be open and connected to the rest of the public. It should be institutionalized, meaning have a legal status, not be just an ad hoc body. And it should be empowered in the sense that its decisions, or at least its recommendations, should have an impact or be capable of having an impact, whether it's because they are sent without filtering to a referendum or to direct regulation, or to a parliamentary debate. So the current model, just to situate things, and I'll stop there and I'll go to the examples. The current model of representative democracy that we have is best sort of normatively reconstructed by the two-track public sphere of Habermas, right? So in this model, you have a larger public sphere where deliberation in the wild among ordinary citizens takes place, and it's supposed to shape the agenda of a second track, of a first track, where elected elites and other officials actually make decisions. And there's a sort of supposed dialectic and circular exchange between those two tracks in such a way that the elected elites are supposed to respond to the needs and demands of the population. It's a very idealized version. One way to think about the next stage of development of that model is to think of it as a three-track model where you would just create a more structured space for deliberation in the wild, where instead of leaving it to people to find each other and talk to each other, which can have very haphazard results in the wild, you would actually structure these conversations. And I think, for example, I'm going to talk about it, but the great national debate in France was an attempt to do just that, to structure deliberation in the wild. But you could also envision something more radical, which in fact turns representative democracy in something different, which I call open democracy, where you try to blur as much as possible the line between the track 1 and track 2, and you decentralize the whole thing such that you have a greater circularity of people and ideas between the locus of decision-making and the locus of deliberation in the wild. And so what I'm envisaging here is a sort of like central open mini-public connected to other local mini-publics that feed it, dialogue with it, and ultimately really shape from the bottom up the conversation that takes place there, even as in the end, you do need a centralizing moment at the national level where the nationwide open mini-public makes proposals for the whole polity that are then submitted to a referendum down the line. So that's ultimately the kind of model that I will recommend for Chile in its efforts to try something new with the constitutional process. Even as I'm aware that now you've committed to an elected assembly, so some of what I say will not necessarily be possible, but I think it's important to have an alternative model in mind. So I just want to say that this may sound far-fetched and utopian, but it turns out that in the last 20 years and even more recently, there's been a lot of experiments around the world in OECD countries in particular to try out these things that I call open mini-publics. Sometimes they're not completely open and they vary in size, but they've been important deliberative experiments. So you can see that there was a first wave in the 80s, and then there's a second wave that's been only climbing in recent years. And so you're going to be part of that pile of case studies. So let me now turn to the concrete examples. So, and the lessons we can derive from them. So I wanted to look at 3 examples that I've studied most closely, so where I have more visibility about what can be learned from them. The Icelandic constitutional process from 2010-2013, which contains important lessons because like your Chilean constitutional process, it was about writing a social contract. And then 2 French experiments, one that was only 2 months long in 2019, the Great National Debate, and another one which is longer and only concluded recently called the Citizens Convention for Climate. So let me talk first about the Icelandic constitutional process. So just like you, it started, just like your process, it started with a revolution of sorts, the so-called pots and pans revolution, just after 2008, when the country burned 7 times its GDP and plunged into a really deep financial and economic crisis. The government was toppled, replaced by a government that said, well, we need to do something, let's write a new constitution, let's send bankers to prison and corrupt bankers to prison and start over. So they started this very interesting process that lasted almost 3 years. And they started it with a national forum of 950 randomly selected citizens that went on to provide recommendations to a constitutional assembly of 25 elected but non-professional politicians, who themselves went on to crowdsource 12 times their draft to the public. And after that process, it took some time for the parliament to put the proposal to a referendum, but they did in October 2012. The draft was approved in the referendum, and then parliament proceeded to ignore it. So nothing happened. But still, it's a very interesting process. The design is interesting. It's interesting because of those three things I just mentioned, those three key democratic innovations that were the National Forum 2010, the Constitutional Council or Assembly, it had various names, and the phase of crowdsourcing for ideas. All things that, to my mind, were relatively new or even completely new. So the National Forum of 950 quasi-randomly selected citizens had as a task to brainstorm the values and principles that they wanted to see included in the Constitution. So it wasn't a hard, long, difficult exercise. It wasn't even that deliberative. They were just asked over a day to think and ask themselves, who are we as Icelanders? What do we want to put in our Constitution? So they did these techniques of generating ideas and compiling them, and then that formed the basis of the later text. One of the ideas that came out from that process was the idea of a public ownership of natural resources that were not already owned, the rights to information, the parliament's role in the supervision of financial management. So it was a very productive exercise. Then they chose to delegate the task of writing the Constitution to a constitutional assembly of 25 amateurs. By that, I mean that none of these people that you can see here were professional politicians. You had a human rights activist who was severely disabled, you had a student, you had a farmer, you had a union representative. I mean, they were not descriptively representative of the larger population. They were a lot more urban, for example. They were a diverse group. Then they chose to try this method of crowdsourcing their drafts, putting it online on Facebook, on their own website, to get the feedback of the population. The right to internet that ended up in the Constitution came straightforwardly from that moment of crowdsourcing. So this was, a failed process at the end of the day. It had all sorts of problems in part because it was the first time that something like this was tried. And so in the end, what's the lesson that derived from this process? It worked in the sense that it produced a good constitutional proposal. In fact, I argue that it's better than the one written at the same time by experts. But it failed to garner enough support in a way because the crowdsourcing phase, the concept was great, but the execution was not so great. They only garnered 3,600 comments, it's not much. And when the referendum time came, only 47% of the population turned out. So that caused the process to have limited legitimacy, and it became easy for the government, the parliament in particular, to ignore the results, the positive results of the referendum, because this looked like a focus group without much representativeness. So the question is, how do you improve mass participation? How do you make, for example, the crowdsourcing phase reach millions of people rather than just a few hundreds? Here, I think there are lessons to be derived from the French Great National Debate. So, because this was really, I think, the first time that I can think of where there was an effort in Europe, at least, to create a moment of mass deliberation, even if there too, the success was only partial and limited. So just for context, I just remind you that here again, the process started in as a direct answer to social movements. We had a massive social crisis in November 2018 after the government tried to raise a fuel tax. So I think it's the same as what happened in Chile, actually, where if I remember correctly, it was the price of subway tickets going up or something like that caused the initial demonstrations. So in any case, the government got scared, realized something needed to be done. And so President Macron decided to write a letter to the French people telling them, let's all calm down, let's have a conversation, let's have a deliberation, a great national debate for 2 months. We're going to put politics on pause, and we're just going to talk to each other, and I am going to listen to you. So this sounded nice, and in fairness, this was, I think, the only possible reasonable move at the time. But of course, this was very constrained, and some say manipulative. There were only 4 topics that were allowed, excluding, for example, immigration, because it was deemed too sensitive. But I'm not here to judge that part of the process. I just wanted to present you with the elements that are interesting and perhaps worth taking up. So there were 7 participatory features in this great debate. The main ones are 3. The online governmental platform, where you had a self-selected participation. The local meetings, so open meetings that anyone could organize around the country. Again, an example of self-selected participation. And finally, the more interesting ones, to my mind at least, the 21 regional assemblies that were based on randomly selected participation. There were more participatory features that I won't talk about for reasons of time, but you should know about them. There are also things that are worth using. So there was first the use of emails and mails. The government received a lot of emails and a lot of mails from the population, 16,000 and over. There were also these, grievance books that harken back to the 1789 grievance books of the French Revolution. 18,000 of them were produced by people writing in city halls and complaining about everything from the administration inefficiency to all kinds of things that are wrong with the French system. They also try to reach out to the population of homeless people or the youth, or like people who are hard to catch usually. So they put terminals in train stations and post offices with like iPads and tablets, and they got a number of thousands of contributions that way. Finally, there were national thematic conferences, which were meant to target organized civil society, namely unions, professional organizations, because those are actually usually very much involved with government, policy making. But in the early version of the great national debate, they had been a little forgotten, and so it was just the focus was on individual citizens. And then it became obvious that you couldn't ignore this layer of associations and unions and people who have things to say as well. So they also organize those conferences for them. So the online platform just looked just like that. This was a basic website, not a terribly well done one. So if you do one, you can definitely improve on it, because the main flaw of that website is that it had 0 deliberative feature, meaning it was just like a box where you could enter input, but you could not exchange with other people, you could not receive feedback. Yet somehow it's probably the place where the most participation actually took place, because there were close to 2 million submissions that came to that website. So it was based on self-selection. As I said, there was no deliberative feature, but generated a lot of traffic. And to this day, I'm not even sure we've analyzed fully the entirety of the input. Then you had the local meetings. Those were organized by anyone who was interested in organizing a meeting, but in practice was also organized by Macron's party, La République En Marche, and all kinds of associations who felt that they had a reason to organize a meeting like that. As you can tell from the picture, it wasn't very representative. A lot of them looked just like that. A lot of retired people with a lot of time on their hands. Youth was completely underrepresented. The yellow vest types were completely underrepresented. But still, it reached a number of people. And the way it worked is that you could upload the content of your deliberations. You were encouraged to upload the content of your deliberation onto the governmental website, so that at the end of the process, there were a lot of little summaries of what had been discussed. So that's, again, an example of what was discussed. Those summaries looked like that. They were not necessarily very long, but they were very useful. So around 9,300 meetings were organized, a lot more than what was expected because the government aimed for 2,000. The problem is that the government didn't find a way to count the participants. So we don't even know how many people actually participated in those events. Some people say 500,000, some people say 700,000. But roughly it sort of happened all over the territory. And so for 61% of the population, it meant that they could have accessed a meeting less than 20 kilometers away from them. So it was a good way to cover the whole territory. Some of them were open, anybody could come. Some of them were closed, so you had to sign up ahead of time, and that's not the ideal, but in some it's good to have the choice, I suppose. It was free format for most, but the government provided methodological kits to help people organize those events. So in the end, 19% were organized by non-profit associations, 1% by for-profit associations, 50% by elected people, and 30%, which is not negligible, by ordinary citizens. As I said, the average age was relatively high, 57. There were more men than women. 50% of the participants were retired. So it was, not representative statistically of the larger population. It was basically the front of President Macron that showed up in support of his idea. The others stayed home. So in order to find more representativeness, you have to turn to the third mode of participation that took place in the regional assembly, that took place in the Great National Debate, the so-called regional assemblies. There were 21 of them, including in the 13 regions of France. There was also one for the youth exclusively, because the youth in France is very much disenchanted with politics and impossible to reach. So they never show up for this kind of thing. So they created one just for the youth. And there were also 5 assemblies organized in our so-called ultramarine territories, our former colonies, basically, where the recruitment mechanism was a bit different. So, but the deliberation processes were very similar. So, for example, I actually went to this one in Fort-de-France in Martinique. This was a much smaller group, only 28 people showed up, and it wasn't truly random, but this was an attempt at reproducing what was going on in the metropolis there as well. So you can see that the smallest one was 23 people, no, actually 19 in Guadeloupe, and the larger one was the one in Paris, in Ile-de-France. 125 people showed up. So in total, these regional assemblies involved 1,400 participants roughly, and they collected a number of interesting proposals, 230 of them. They involved 32 animators, 195 facilitators, 19 fact checkers, etc. I think they cost around 12 to 13 million euros in total for a day and a half each. And the selection, I could go into detail, but that's not really, that's a bit technical, but they did stratified random sampling on things like age, gender, socioeconomic criteria. They reached out people by SMS and phone call. The uptake rate wasn't that great. That's still the case in many of these experiments, but it's partly because, at least in France, people hadn't heard of things like this before, and so it took them a while to, some people just didn't take the invitation seriously. In terms of the methodology they used, it's a pretty standard one. The first day they meet, they were exposed to a PowerPoint about the Grand Débat's preliminary results. So basically what had happened in the region, in the self-organized assemblies, and on the website, on the governmental website. And then the second day, they were finally allowed to talk about solutions to the problems they had identified. And they ended up formulating, proposals and voting on them at the end. So the beauty of these exercises is that these assemblies, unlike the self-organizing meetings, managed to involve people who never participated in anything political before. As you can see, like this is this rectangle. People who said, I've never participated in anything like this before, were 60% of the participants. So that's a nice result, that they managed to reach that kind of population. And additionally, people were quite happy about what they had experienced in those regional assemblies. See, the grades are high out of 10. The lowest one is 6.6 in terms of rhythm, because it was very fast paced. But otherwise, in terms of the quality of exchange between citizens, they rated them 8.3 out of 10. So, and the global satisfaction was 7.8. So these are ways to generate a lot of satisfaction in the citizenry, while really tapping, a reservoir of citizens that is rarely tapped. Now, the problem with this great national debate is that it mixed up so many formats that was really hard to analyze. So when it came to the online contributions, they used, somewhat advanced technologies to like figure out, where people were. They used concept trees. They used big data analysis, but it wasn't that sophisticated. And so that's going to be one of the difficulty for you as well. If you multiply formats, the question is, what do you make of all that input, and how do you organize, hierarchize, and make sense of it? So just to sum up the participation overall, because that's, I think, the main achievement of this great national debate, they managed to mobilize somewhere around 2 million people superficially, and 1,500 at most deeply in the regional assemblies. There's also something that happened which is not negligible. I said that the great national debate didn't really reach the yellow vests. That is true, they chose not to participate, but they organized their own counter debate called the true debate, because they thought Macron's great national debate was a joke. And they involved 45,000 participants themselves in the margins of the great national debate. So what I get from that is that there are ripple effects to organizing something like that. Even the opposition starts playing the game in the margin. And so that's better than not having that kind of conversation. So, so let's say up to 3% of the population in France participated in some fashion. And there are, of course, all the difficult to measure ripple effects of those things that are good. So was this a case of mass deliberation or deliberation at scale, as some hoped? I don't think so. It was more a case of very small clusters in self-selected or randomly selected groups. But it was still an improvement in the sense that it tried to structure public deliberation in track 2. And as I said, there were ripple effects that are also important. So it's something like this, right? So you still have your track 1 where all the decisions are made, but you have now a track 3 between the anarchical sphere of deliberation in the world, where people are somewhat organized, somewhat given a purpose, somewhat made to meet in structured context where they can generate proposals that then could have been taken seriously by track 1. So in practice, it wasn't, not terribly. So it was more of a moment of catharsis and inclusive deliberation that I think was good for the country. But because there was no clear way to aggregate the results of all these diverse participatory forums, or no way to prioritize some input over others, it led naturally to cherry picking by the executive of the results that they liked. So one of the results that Macron said he came out of this process was that clearly the French people want fewer taxes. This is very debatable. In fact, it looked at to other people that they wanted more fiscal justice and a better state, but not necessarily fewer taxes. So that's a problem. And because there was no institutionalization, because there was no pre-commitment to making these recommendations from the French people impactful, they were not very impactful. That said, one positive outcome as well is that it this great national debate really, in my view, paved the way for and culminated, in fact, in the Citizens' Convention for Climate in October 2020. So let me now turn to my last example, the French Citizens' Convention for Climate. Why do I say it's a result of the great national debate? Because when they analyzed the results of the regional assemblies, they found out that 12 of the 21 assemblies wanted a new type of governance to manage the ecological transition. And apparently, among the many reasons that made President Macron embrace the idea of a nation-level citizens' assembly was that slide that was shown to him by organizers. That he thought, well, okay, well, you know, climate change, after all, my fuel tax caused the Yellow Vest movement. So why don't we try something like a citizens' assembly on issues of climate change and fiscal and environmental justice? So this is what the convention looked like. It's a group of 150 randomly selected citizens that were brought for several months, I mean, for several weekends rather, in this beautiful brutalist palace of Vienna, which is currently the seat of our third legislative chamber, the so-called Sesión, Environmental, Economic and Social Council, which is a strange institution that was kind of declining at the time and that seized the opportunity to reinvent its role in the French landscape. So here is like the agenda that the schedule they had to meet. They met from October to 2019 to June 2020. They had 7 sessions. They asked for one more actually, because initially they were supposed to have only 6, but they said we won't have enough time, we need a 7th one. And ultimately in February 2001, so it's not represented here, but there was an additional one after the convention was over to evaluate the impact of this assembly on the parliamentary law that came out of the recommendations. The government mandate was precisely to reduce France's greenhouse gas emission by 40% of the 1990s levels by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. And interestingly too, which was really novel, I think, the mission statement by the Prime Minister said that the citizens should co-construct with experts these proposals. So it was a very bold move in a way, because it said, well, bold and not so bold in a way, because on the one hand it said, look, you guys, 150 of you, have to produce quasi-legislative proposals. You're almost in the position of lawmakers here. At the same time, we don't trust you entirely, so we would like you to co-construct this with experts. That was a sort of like double-edged to the message here. So this looks like this. You know, they met in plenary sessions. They were subdivided into 5 thematic subgroups at random by taking a token from one of those little bags. They listened to a lot of experts. There were over 140 experts involved in the whole process. They used different techniques, including, of course, the post-it methods, but also things like speed dating with experts to meet as many of them as possible. It was also an interesting process because they opened themselves up to the larger public. This was actually more of a choice of the citizens themselves than the organizers, who were deathly afraid of losing control initially. But the public, the citizens in this convention felt that they had a responsibility to reach out to the entire French people. Otherwise, they would have no legitimacy in making recommendations. So they reached out on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. They gave interviews to the media. They organized so-called climaperos, meaning moments of conviviality where you get to present the work of the convention. And they also went to knock on doors. They talked to their, mayors, their local representatives, etc., etc. They eventually created an association of the 150 who went on to work with government, parliament, and administrations on the implementations of the recommendations. So the results of all this is that in June 2020, they came up with 149 proposals. Immediately, President Macron, though he had promised to not veto anything and take everything, wholesale, vetoed 3 of them. Conservative estimates is that only 15% of the recommendations have been implemented to this day. The rest of the recommendations have been largely ignored or diluted by Parliament because, you know, the lobbies came in and immediately proceeded to kill especially the more radical proposals. And the one proposed modification of the Constitution that was the only proposal that could have ended up being submitted to a referendum in the fall 2021 ultimately will not be submitted to a referendum because Macron said he was in favor of that referendum. It would have been a nice way to end the process with an inclusion of the larger public, but the Senate adamantly refused. So this is not going to happen. So my evaluation overall, I mean, this is my evaluation right now. It's, you know, it's changing over time, but I think the design was smart. It was a centralizing moment, but connected to the larger public. It built to a degree on the great national debate, and it went very quickly from a confidential exercise to being a mediatized political actor. It produced quasi-legislation supported by expert work. And in fact, the citizens themselves in the convention didn't know that, but the proposals would have been supported by the population had they been submitted to a referendum. We have polls now that document that. Unfortunately, the executive, President Macron, did not keep the promise of, you know, no filter, meaning really putting the recommendations directly to regulation, a referendum, or parliamentary debate. So a lot of the recommendations were diluted. And sadly, in a way, the citizens from the convention themselves did not trust the larger public. They made the choice to not submit most of the proposals to a referendum, except the proposals that were a modification of the Constitution. So the result is that all these, you know, tweaks and choices caused the convention's recommendations to have a limited impact. So what can now, and I'll conclude briefly now, what can Chile learn from all this? My sense is that the goal should be to widen participation as much as possible and to multiply participation formats as much as possible, a little bit on the model of the Great National Debate. But unlike the Great National Debate, you need to have a vision for how to structure and hierarchize clearly the publics you are involving. Because you cannot put on the same level the recommendation of a group that only represents the Macron voters and the recommendations of an assembly that's randomly selected and tracks a little bit more closely the preference of the larger population. So that there's a way in which all these things are valuable, but you have to prioritize. So my suggestion would be to go, and again, I know that there's already a commitment to an elected assembly as a constituent assembly, so this is not going to happen, but if there's a way to use that model somewhere else, it would be to create a network of regional open mini publics feeding and dialoguing with a national citizens assembly. And the National Citizens Assembly, a bit like the convention in France, would be ultimately responsible for generating the final proposals that would then be submitted to a nationwide referendum, which hasn't happened in the French case. And very importantly, in order for any of this to have an impact in the end, you need to get public authorities to pre-commit to this participation to have an impact, and to organizing some kind of way to follow up on the work of official institutions to check that they have indeed implemented the recommendations. So just to remind you of like the model I have in mind, it's closer to something like this rather than the simple augmentation and structuring of have an impact in the end. You need to get public authorities to pre-commit. And that is it for me. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for the very interesting and enlightening presentation about the different proposals and experiences that you have had in Europe because of the deliberative processes. It is very important, and it is also very interesting that part of the discussion that we have had in Chile had to do with this coexistence from between this self-composed deliberative processes and some other processes such as the random election, as you mentioned. And now I'm going to give the floor to Juan Gabriel Valdez, and he's part of our university from the strategic department, and he's going to make some comments from the in terms of the work of Professor Landemore. Thank you very much, and I would like to say hello to everybody, and especially to the Professor Landemore. I'm going to be very brief because I think what is very important today are the questions and the capability of deliberate according to what the professor just presented. I think that Ellen's work is the most important contribution that we can have today to the current debate in terms of the scope and our experience of our constituent. And I haven't been able to read the book as a whole, but I was very impressed about her with the representative democracy, not only in terms of her criticism, but she's reacting in terms of this crisis of this representative democracy, and to have a deliberation, a popular deliberation that would allow this uh, that kind of democracy will survive. We need to have a survival. And she mentioned this. This is not a direct democracy that she is defending, but this is something that is necessary to save some sort of a representative democracy which is in a deep crisis, not only threatening our countries, but also in Europe. And we've got a lot of authoritarian populism, and we can generate situations that we cannot manage. So the answer is more democracy and more citizen participation, and the elites are being separated from the citizens. That goes together, that the polarized elites, and with the feedback from the comments from the communication and the press, that is way more difficult for the democratic societies. It can only be renewed by a participation that is increased by the citizens. And deliberative democracy is not only a needed opportunity, and this is a demand that is key for us to move forward into a process of democracy. But the interesting thing about the work of Professor Landemore is that this is not something that has to do with a theoretical dream. This is this is an empiric work that allow us to act on real situations, and that is what makes her contributions to be so important for our current discussion and for our current constitutional discussion. I wanted to read what she wrote, but we've got quite similar situations as the one that she mentioned, especially with France, because the constituent process in Chile is in something that is in the opposite direction of the elites. This is just the opposite. And in the second place, the citizens that will choose or will elect non-experts in politics, and the citizens have been wise enough to elect people that do not come from the parties, do not come or from the political world, but those are people who represent a world that is very different, a miscellaneous world, and that gives a good process to the citizens, which agrees with this constitutional assembly. And of course, the first week of work for the of the Constitutional Assembly has the opposition of a group that they think that this is an exercise that is meant to fail, and we need to and to make sure about, because this express the reaction of the elite, and they feel that the people standing there do not have the category to face a challenge like this as to have a new constitution. At the same time, this is constitutional conventions in the Chilean manner that we want to have participation, we want transparency. This morning, the president of Universidad de Chile was mentioning to the indigenous constituent that the television channel of the university is going to be broadcasting live all the debates. And that is something very important from the university, but that is a characteristic that this constitutional convention wants. We want their debates to be broadcast live. But yes, from what we are looking at external and European experiences, it is clear that we still need to move forward in terms of the citizen participation, in terms of what the Constitutional Convention is doing today. Our constituents, they feel, and this is something that we need to support, that their participation and their activity in the regions of the country, their their communication with the people who elected them is key. But it seems not to be enough. It means that we should have a possibility to what it is called in the US, the crowdsourcing. And I believe that today it is not really considered in our country how to do this sort of open consultation and permanent consultation by using the different means that we've got at hand in terms of the technology in order to have some real proposals to the convention we have done in the past. But today we're not in clear conditions to do it throughout the dialogue and the debate of the Constitutional Assembly. And President Bachelet, she had hundreds of meetings in the country. And those opportunities were very important to move the citizens towards a new constitution. There was an effort that didn't finish, but it had a value. Institutions that were different, they made exercises like this one. I remember the Foundation Democracy and Development, which built through internet different consultations, thousands of consultations. They covered 560 proposals for the new constitution, and they published books about how it could be the constitution of the common people. We have made these different things, and today we need to continue working to face the challenges that we're going to have a long time. These constitutions, I think it is important to mention, this is not in an environment that was calm. These constitutions came from a social unrest process. And, and this is because this society discovers and reveals and puts on the table their extraordinary diversity, the lack of homogeneity, and this is totally opposite to the Icelandic situation. This is a diverse and a contradictory society where the different groups have been fighting on the streets to be heard and to have participation. So the challenges to have a participation among in terms of the debate are very important. In the first place, I see that there is a difficulty in the trends of the press. I would love to have I would love to hear your opinion, Professor Landemore, about the participation of the press in terms of the mass media in the case of Iceland, for instance, because the media tends to turn this constitutional convention into a reality show where all the members of the assembly are in an area with a camera, but we don't have a good connection with the citizens that are part of this convention with the citizens as a whole. And the second place, I think it is totally necessary to take into account the activity of the social and political elite. There is no better expression than what El Mercurio newspaper mentioned last week. It says that there is a problem, a disease, when they express about the participation of the indigenous peoples and also with the women, because there is a complex reaction toward what's coming in the future and how the mass media is going to cover this process. How do we call for the participation in a society that is quite divided because of the lack of trust? And after that, we need to process all the results of that citizen consultation, because there we've got a lot of questions and different aspects which are totally interesting and can be solved in an important manner by the contribution of the universities. And after that, I think it is very important what Professor Landemore is mentioning about this trend of asking people to set what are their priorities, but not to have a debate. They've got a hierarchy of priorities, and with that, they think that it was a deliberation. We're trying to generate the liberation here, so the capability of people not only about to think, but to create a new reality and to change their own perceptions about things. And I would like to know, what is the role of the political parties on this? I was reading your work about Iceland, but I didn't see that it was a lot of, maybe you didn't mention the political parties that much. I don't know the Islamic society that much, but in the process in France, there was the political parties were mentioned and also the government. But here, there is no possibility that the government is going to call for this constitutional assembly. So those calls will come from some authorities that can be a mayor or the governors, but not the government. And I would like to stop here because with this, I can go on talking and talking. And because we would like to continue with this participation, and we need to have the opportunity for the Q&A. And in terms of what Professor Landemore and regarding the book and the articles that we were presented, there is a richness for Chile and for the debate that we've got, which is extremely valuable. And I think that we should continue working on this text, because that allows us to continue thinking how can we have a collective work that will give the Constitutional Assembly more legitimacy, and they've got strong enemies ahead of them. So it is important for us to continue working and to give the Constitutional Convention to make it more legitimate and more right, and also to be empowered of the work of this constitutional convention, and also and all the efforts that are going to be given by all the members of this constitutional convention. So thank you very much.
Comentarios, interesantes comentarios.
Thank you, Gabriel, for your very interesting comments. And you touched upon several of the important aspects of our process. I'd like to offer the floor to Hélène so that she can react to these comments and then move on to the Q&A session. So please, Hélène, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the comments. I actually learned a lot from listening to you. I just wanted to try to answer your question about the role of the media and the parties, because you're absolutely right. These are crucial actors in a process like this, and they can be allies or foes, and it's really important to make them allies. And I'm not entirely sure how you do that, to be honest, but it's a learning process for all the countries that have gone through these experiments before. So in the case of Iceland, what people have told me there is that, you know, in the electoral campaign to choose the 25 members of the assembly that was going to draft the constitutional proposal, there were 525 people who ran to be elected. The media had no idea how to cover so many candidacies. 525 people, like how do you know, which one do you choose? How do you prioritize? So they ended up not covering it. And so they didn't do a good job at all. So what happened is that the people who had campaigned early, who had already some kind of social visibility because they had been very involved in the protests against government in 2008, or the people who had a social media presence that they had built over the years, ended up winning. Like that's just what happened. So the professor of economics was already famous one. He became chair of that council. A lawyer who had been very active and throwing yogurt and bananas to, on the parliament wall during the protests, she also became a figure and won. So that became, and so the media played very little role in this election. They just didn't know how to cover it. And I was thinking that one way to solve that would be for the media to learn to perhaps use, software and digital tools to help organize candidacies by keyword or key principles, so that people can identify candidates by identifying the key principles they care about. And so you wouldn't have to sift through 523 or 25 profiles and programs. You would just have to, have some kind of algorithm define it for you, which raises all kinds of issues. But at some point, when you have that mass of data and information to process, we will have to find a technological solution. I don't see anything or any other way around it. So in France, the media did a much better job, I would say. It took time because initially this, as I said, this exercise was relatively confidential. But then the president got involved. And in fact, very smartly, the members of the convention invited the president to talk to them in January 2020 and sit down with them. So of course, if the president, where the president goes, the media follows. So they covered that. It was a big deal. It really considerably improved the visibility and media presence of the convention. And they started making writing articles about the members, and there were profiles in the written press. The members started being invited on TV to talk to journalists. And one problem that I think I observed is that journalists are primed to focus on electoral types. The one who speak the most during plenaries, the one who speak well, the one who are like have the kind of telegenic presence that TV or the media in general like. And that biased a little bit the sample of people that were actually shown. And that's my regret. I remember actually talked to a journalist and I said, why don't you focus also on the shy, the not so charismatic, the women, the older, the younger, try to, and I think they did after a while. It's not because of me, of course, but because they learned. It was a learning curve for a lot of them. Like, how do you cover an object like that? Because it's not a regular parliament. These are not regular politicians. So it's really hard. It's just the media themselves have to learn an entirely new way of talking about that object and about those people. Now, the role of the parties. So in the Icelandic case, you had basically very little involvement of the parties. To the extent that they were involved, they were against the process. The Independence Party was adamantly opposed to the process because the threat of having natural resources collectivized, if you will, at least those that were not already privately owned, meant that the economic interests they represented would not benefit from exploiting the fishing grounds of Iceland for free anymore. So that was just such an economic threat that they had to fight in all kinds of ways. Plus, concentration of the media in Iceland is really important, so that you've got a few conglomerates that own all the media. So they were not going to do a good objective job at any point. In France, the parties, I'm talking about the parties. Sorry, I mixed up the two. So the parties were, I think they were for or against the process according to the economic interests of the people they represented. So it wasn't a great example. In France, my sense is that the parties were sort of at a loss as to what to think of those things. By default, opposition parties were against the great national debate because, you know, this was a strategy by Macron to buy social peace, buy time, etc. I think for the Citizens Convention, there was a lot more benevolence because it was considered it was organized by an independent group, so it didn't seem as controlled by the president or the executive as the great national debate had been. And so some parties were in support, and you know, Green parties in particular sort of slowly rallied to it. But I think it's the same thing. It's a learning curve. They don't know how to adapt and what to do with this object, because in a way it's competition for them, right? They don't have a control over those people. Those people are like free atoms. They don't have allegiance to a party. They often don't want to reveal who they vote for. So it's just really hard. These are two types of animals that just, you know, the convention and the parties that just don't know how to talk to each other. So I don't have the answer, to be honest. But I think you need to have at least some parties on board, some organizations on board, some elements of the existing apparatus on board for any of this to go through. Because if you don't, you end up with the Icelandic scenario where this thing is killed at the end of the process. It just is ignored.
Thank you very much.
Gracias, Hélène, por esta interesante respuesta.
Thank you, Hélène, for this very interesting answer. I'm sure that there are a lot of debates on these 2 points, the participation of the media and the role of political parties in this process, which is completely new. Now, let's move on to the Q&A session. We have a couple of people who will ask questions. First of all, Professor Constanza Eden from the Faculty of Law, who will ask her first question. Constanza, please. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. My question refers to the constituent process, of course. Lately, the Constitutional Convention that will draft the new Constitution begins to discuss the regulation of the Convention. Now, and this is discussed both within and without the Convention, the need to incorporate mechanisms for citizen participation so that citizens can have an impact on the deliberations of the Convention. And so based on this proposal, I have 3 questions that are all related. These are not 3 completely unrelated questions, but they all point in the same direction. And that has to do with the 3 stages, 3 processes from involving citizens' voice and up until the convention. And these are the questions. What participative mechanisms out of the ones that you have mentioned would you recommend that we use for this purpose? The second question is, what methodology, systematization methodology, would you recommend in order to ensure that participation can indeed impact, have an influence on the convention? And the third question, which involves a third stage, so to speak, is how should we use the results or citizens' recommendations? How should the convention deal with these results or recommendations? Should they be binding? Should they just be recommendations? Is there some kind of intermediate aspect here? So the questions involve these 3 stages related to the constitutional process. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanza, for these questions. I feel an enormous responsibility here. I really want you to take whatever I say with a grain of salt, because what do I know? I'm just going to tell you what I think is a reasonable option, but really I think no one has the answer, but I'll try. So my thinking is that when it comes to the last question, the recommendations from the convention, I think that the best model for me remains Iceland, where it's not binding, but it goes to a referendum. And the referendum in Iceland wasn't binding either. But ideally, the political class, the parliament, would have a moral duty to be bound by the recommendations. I think that there's got to be some kind of like collective desire to settle this. So again, maybe the situation in Chile is such that you cannot count on your political elites and the political system to not fight to the death against change. So in that case, leaving the ultimate decision in their hands, whether or not they're going to take into consideration the referendum and all that, might be, setting oneself up for failure. But I don't really fully understand the constitutional constraints on your process. So for me, it's better if it's a consensual movement throughout and everybody's on board, right? Because if you force things, it loses in legitimacy. So it's better if the parties, if the existing, institutions are on board. But maybe this cannot be done. And if you don't want to end up in a position like Iceland, then maybe it's better to create some kind of further constraints, legal constraints or other constraints. It could be through the pressure of social movements. Maybe that's what you need. You need social movements to demonstrate every day of the convention that we want this to be implemented. We want this to be implemented or else. I don't know. I just, it's a very difficult question, the question of the output and the way you make sure it's implemented. Now, the first question about the mechanisms for participation. So my understanding is that now you are committed to an elected assembly, which has quotas for women, for indigenous people, which is all great. It's very important that this diversity be present. But because it's based on election, it still has all the blind spots that I find problematic. So you're a little bit in the situation of Iceland, actually, where you have a greater diversity of profiles in your constituent assembly than you would otherwise, but it's still pretty elitist, let's face it, right? So what you need to do then is make sure you reach out to the people who would not have stood a chance of being elected. So it's not just like you have 50% women, that's great, but it's a category of women who were able to win elections. How about the ones who don't have the charisma, who don't have the time, who don't have the resources, who don't have the, any of the qualities that can make you win an election? Reach out to those as a way to counterbalance the bias introduced by the mechanism of elections. But, so you can try to counterbalance that explicitly by oversampling these categories. I don't know how you do that, to be honest, but I'm sure there are ways statistically to do that. Or you can just also organize randomly selected regional assemblies, kind of like on the French model of the Great National Debate. And again, you ask them to either work on the drafts of the Constitution that the convention will propose at some point, so they can give feedback that then the convention has some moral duty to listen to very carefully. Or you can, I don't know if it's in simultaneously or down the line, or you can just ask them to brainstorm if it's easier, and because I imagine this is costly and logistically very complicated. You can ask them to do what the Icelandic people did with the National Forum of 950 randomly selected citizens, where it wasn't that time consuming, it was just for a day, and they were asked about the main values that they wanted to have in their constitution. And that too can be fed into the work of the convention, because that will be, if there are multiple, let's say you have, I don't know how many regions you have in Chile, but let's say you have 25 regional assemblies, say, and they kind of all converge. I showed you how in the Great National Debate, 12 of them converge on the idea of a new democratic governance on ecological transition. Maybe if you do 25 regional randomly selected assemblies of, say, 100 people each, and they kind of like all converge, or a great majority of them converge on some things, impact, I don't think it exists. I think you can, what you can do is try to educate the ultimate decision makers about why it's important, why this process is important and will succeed, and why they need to trust the process, such that they are willing to pre-commit to the outcome. If they don't pre-commit to the outcome, you guarantee you they will pick and choose, and they will try to delegitimize that's what's going to happen. So I don't really have an answer about ways to systematize for impact. I think pre-committing, making sure you buy goodwill from the beginning. Probably the best thing is to not alienate, try to not alienate the various parties that are part of this process. So even people who criticize, who think this is going to fail, just take them by the hand, take them to these regional assemblies, make them sit with people, make them understand that there's actually something like collective wisdom that can emerge when it's conducted well, when these processes are conducted well. I hope it helps a little.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Gracias, Hélène. Tenemos ahora la segunda pregunta.
Thank you, Hélène. Now we have the second question asked by Ana María Moraga. Ana María, please, you have the floor. Professor Landemore, I have a question with regards the Constitution and what the citizens may think about three aspects. About political membership, about the rights of others. National territories are inhabited by people who are regarded as national citizens, resident and foreign. So there be a sort of stratification in terms of access to rights and belongingness to politics. After that, it is said that migrants uphold care and services chains for the reproduction of life. That has been demonstrated by authors such as Saskia Sachin, and we have evidence that during the pandemic, viewing people from different nationalities with critical jobs that are not susceptible of working from home. The reality of these people are the same as the will that has been expressed in the streets. And thirdly, the children of these people are often Chileans, and that leads us to the problem of representing not only the migrant communities or communities of people that have migrated into Chile, but of the participation of boys and girls in the constituent process, understanding that there is no reserved seats for this segment of society. So bearing in mind that constituent processes are often deal with nationals, with with people that have been born in Chile, how can we promote participation mechanisms that guarantee the participation in equal conditions of diversities in equal terms, in intergenerational terms, and also in terms of identities? When you have discussed certain participatory methodologies, but you have not really discussed those in depth because of time. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. So what you said about the boys and girls, and it's actually really important because our systems are often not only in oligarchic, plutocratic systems, but I would also add gerontocratic systems. It's really ruled by the old for the old. So it's really important to make room for the young generation. They're actually the only ones who seem to care about the planet. They have to have a voice in this process. And I think the way the French Convention included them is actually something to be that probably should have been replicated, although as I understand it's too late in your case. They included a quota of young people. I think there were about 7 of them who were under 18 of age. So they had a voice, they spoke often, they were influential, they were listened to. And it helped sort of like forge this intergenerational bond, actually. Really, it was a way to pacify the relationship between them. So one way you could fix that, since you didn't make quotas for, you didn't include quotas for people that are younger than 18, I guess, is to create something that took place in the Great National Debate, this specific randomly selected assembly for the youth. And the youth, you can understand it in, generous ways. In our case, I think it was anyone from 15 to 28, perhaps even older, to make sure that their voices are heard, especially post-pandemic, where they're the ones we've sacrificed for the older generations, whose economic prospects are dire, who will never own as much of a share of wealth as the older generations. I mean, it's just, if anything, we should overcompensate. So I think that's one solution, to create a national level, randomly selected assembly of just for the youth, so they can generate their own proposals. And here again, the actual convention should have a moral duty to integrate their input. And then for the non-Chilean and the migrants and the foreign residents, yes, that's. I guess it would be odd to have an assembly just for them, but surely there's a way to reach out to representatives of these groups and have them write grievance books, like again on the French model, where they write everything that's wrong with the way they're being treated, everything that's they feel that they could do for the country, everything that they actually do for the country, and ask them about their conception of fairness. I'm pretty sure you'd be surprised by how undemanding they're going to end up being. I think, if you put people in a position of like deliberating in an informed manner and in the position of being taken seriously, it's amazing how restrained and reasonable people come out to be. So I think that that's one way, just give them a space somewhere, somehow, where they can come up with like, maybe grievance books is not the right term because this sounds whining, but like suggestions or like ideas for improving the lot of people just like them. And so this gives them a sense of being the representatives of a community that might have been mistreated or not considered enough in recent years or something like that. I hope that helps a little too much.
Gracias, profesora Landemore. Ha sido muy interesante.
Thank you very much, Professor Landemore, especially in this hour and a half that we have had of conversation. And of course, I'm sure that there are many other questions that we could analyze and discuss, but what we've got as a commitment with Professor Landemore is that she's going to be with us, and we will have the opportunity to discuss with her throughout the months and weeks to come. She is very interested in the process that we're carrying out in Chile. And for us, this is an honor and a privilege to have Professor Landemore in this process, both with the internal process that we're carrying out at the Universidad de Chile, but also in the Constitutional Assembly in the country. So I would like to really thank you for your lecture, Professor, and this opens the opportunity for the way and the category of analysis that is going to be very useful and interesting. At the same time, I would like to thank you, Juan Gabriel, for your very interesting comment and the opening new points of view that should be analyzed and is going to be part of the discussion. And Constanza, Inen, and Ana Maria, who asked, and everybody who participated today in the Zoom and also in Facebook Live and YouTube. It has been a pleasure, a very good session, and I would like to thank you, and please stay with our community of students and members of the academia, because I think that throughout these seminars and the discussion that we are carrying out with these working groups of the CCI, we're going to be able to contribute to this process that we are carrying out at a country level. This is a beautiful opportunity for the university to contribute, and this is an example of this kind of seminar that we're carrying out. But from this point onwards, we're going to have some deeper discussion about how to carry out this constitutional process and also the different members of the university. So thank you very much, Professor Landemore, and we will stay in touch.
Gracias.
to carry out this very important process. So thank you very much.